Michael, a law student just trying to relax with friends when a noise complaint brings the police to his door. Sounds simple, right? But what happens next isn't simple at all. It spirals into a tense situation, raising questions about rights, misunderstandings, and how easily things can escalate, especially for young black men in America. Get ready for twists and turns, and a story that will make you think. Let me know in the comments below where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers around the world. And if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of Michael's story. You definitely won't want to miss how this all unfolds. Let's dive into the story. The bass thumped, softly, not too loud, just enough to give a good vibe to the apartment. It was Friday night, and Michael's small place near campus was buzzing, but in a chill way. Pizza boxes were scattered on the coffee table next to half-empty soda cans and textbooks that were definitely not being opened tonight. Michael, a 20-year-old law student with a quick smile and eyes that missed nothing, was laughing at something his friend David just said. David was gesturing wildly, acting out a story from their morning class. Something about a professor and a very confused pigeon that had wandered into the lecture hall. Around the room, a few other friends were chatting, some playing a low-key video game on the TV. It was a mix of faces Michael had known since freshman year and some newer friends from his pre-law society. Everyone was just unwinding after a long week of classes, exams, and the usual stress of college life. Michael's apartment wasn't fancy. It was typical student housing, a bit worn around the edges, but he kept it clean and it felt like home. Posters of legal icons, Thurgood Marshall, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, hung on the walls, mixed in with some classic movie posters and a banner from his fraternity. "Yo, Mikey, you got any more of that root beer?" asked Maria, one of his classmates, pointing her empty can towards him. "Coming right up," Michael grinned, heading towards the small kitchen. He opened the fridge, which was mostly empty except for pizza leftovers and drinks. "Looks like we're almost out. Guess someone's making a late-night run later." "I'm on it," volunteered Aisha, another friend, grabbing her keys from the hook by the door. "Need anything else while I'm out?" "Nah, just the root beer is good," Michael said, tossing her a friendly wave as she headed out. He came back to the living room, handing Maria a fresh drink. The music shifted to a smoother track, and the conversation turned to weekend plans. A movie night, maybe a hike tomorrow if the weather stayed nice. It was just a normal Friday, the kind of evening countless college students were having across the country. Relaxed, friendly, easygoing. No drama, no problems. Just good friends and good times. For now, at least. About half an hour later, just as the group was debating the merits of action movies versus comedies, there was a sharp knock at the door. Not a friendly, casual knock. This was louder, more insistent. Michael frowned slightly. "Expecting anyone else?" he asked, glancing around at his friends. Everyone shook their heads. "Pizza delivery again?" David joked, but there was a slight pause in the conversation, a subtle shift in the easy vibe. Michael went to the door and looked through the peephole. His eyebrows raised a fraction. Guys," he said, turning back to the room, his voice a little lower. "It's police." A ripple of unease went through the room. Music stopped. Conversation died down completely. Everyone looked at Michael, a question in their eyes. He opened the door carefully. Standing in the hallway were two uniformed police officers. One was a woman, maybe in her late 30s, with a serious expression. The other was a younger man, looking a bit more impatient, Michael thought. "Evening, officers," Michael said, trying to keep his tone neutral, polite. "Everything okay?" The woman officer stepped forward slightly. "We've received a noise complaint from a neighbor in this building, apartment 3B. Is this your residence?" "Yes, ma'am, it is," Michael replied. "We were just hanging out, watching a movie. Was it too loud?" We can definitely turn it down. He immediately gestured to the speakers, ready to lower the volume. He hadn't realized they were being that loud. The younger officer spoke up, his voice a little sharper than the woman's. Turn it down? Sir, we got a complaint. Said it was excessive noise, disturbing the peace. Okay, understood, Michael said quickly, again moving to adjust the non-existent music volume, since they'd already turned it off. We didn't mean to cause any trouble, it's just a few friends. A few friends sounds like a party to the complainant, the younger officer said, his eyes flicking past Michael into the apartment, taking in the group inside. How many people are in there? Michael hesitated for a split second. Maybe 6? 7? Including me? He really hadn't counted. It was a small get-together. 6 or 7, the officer repeated, his tone skeptical. And how much alcohol has been consumed? Alcohol? Michael blinked, genuinely surprised by the question. None. We're all under 21, officer. Just pizza and soda tonight. It was true. He and his friends were serious about staying on the right side of the law, especially him, given his future legal aspirations. The woman officer glanced at her partner, then back at Michael. Okay. Regardless, the noise level was reported as disruptive. Keep it down for the rest of the evening. We don't want to have to come back. Absolutely, officer. We will. Sorry about that, Michael said, relieved. He thought that was, it. Just a warning. A bit embarrassing, but no big deal. But then the younger officer said, License and student ID, please. Michael's relief evaporated. Excuse me, he asked, his brow furrowing. License and ID? For a noise complaint? Standard procedure, sir, the officer said, his voice now flat and firm. Just need to verify who we're speaking with. License and student ID. He held out his hand, expectantly. The friendly Friday night vibe in the apartment had vanished completely. The air was now thick with tension. Michael's friends were all watching from just behind him, silent, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. This simple noise complaint had suddenly escalated. And Michael didn't understand why. Michael blinked again, staring at the younger officer, trying to process what he'd just heard. Standard procedure? He repeated, carefully keeping his voice even. With all due respect, officers, for a noise complaint? I'm pretty sure that's not typically how it works. He wasn't trying to be confrontational, but his law school instincts were kicking in. He knew basic rights, understood how police interactions should go. This felt off. The younger officer's jaw tightened slightly. Sir, are you refusing to provide identification? His voice was now laced with a clear edge of impatience. No, sir, not refusing, Michael said quickly, holding up his hands slightly in a calming gesture. I want to understand why it's necessary. We said we'd lower the noise. We are cooperating. Is there some other reason you need our IDs? He glanced at the woman officer, hoping she'd be the voice of reason. The woman officer looked at Michael, her expression unreadable. We're responding to a complaint, she stated, her tone measured. And we need to ensure everything is in order. She was being deliberately vague, Michael realized. In order? David spoke up from behind Michael, stepping forward slightly. With all due respect, officers, we're just hanging out. It's Friday night. What exactly are you checking for? Do you think we're doing something illegal here? David's voice was getting louder, his own frustration rising. David, chill, Michael murmured, trying to diffuse the situation. He knew escalating things wasn't going to help, but he understood David's anger. This felt like they were being treated like criminals for existing too loudly on a Friday evening. The younger officer turned his attention to David now, his posture becoming more rigid. Sir, I need you to step back. This is between me and Mr. He looked back at Michael, expecting a name. Carter. Michael Carter, Michael supplied, feeling a knot forming in his stomach. He reached into his back pocket slowly. "Okay, officer, here's my student ID." He offered it, holding his driver's license back for a moment. The officer the student ID, glanced at it briefly and then held out his hand again, more insistently this time. "Driver's license too, Mr. Carter. And may I ask why?" Michael pressed again, his polite tone now strained, replaced by a firm, underlying resistance. He was starting to feel cornered, profiled. Was it because they were young? Because most of them were black. He hated that his mind was jumping there, but he couldn't shake the feeling. The younger officer finally offered something that sounded a little more like an explanation, though it still felt thin and insufficient. "We need to run a standard warrants check, sir. It's for everyone's safety." "A warrants check?" Maria interjected, her voice sharp with disbelief. She stepped closer to Michael, standing by his side. "For a noise complaint? You think we have outstanding warrants because someone complained about music?" The younger officer ignored Maria, his focus locked on Michael. "Driver's license, sir. Now." His hand remained outstretched, unwavering. Michael looked from the officer's face to his friend's worried expressions. He was a law student. He knew his rights. He also knew that sometimes arguing with a police officer on the doorstep just made things worse. But something in him balked at just handing over his license without a real reason, without understanding why this had suddenly become so much more than a simple request to quiet down. He hesitated, his hand still in his pocket, his eyes meeting the officer's in a silent, tense standoff. The hallway seemed to have grown smaller, the air heavier. This wasn't just about noise anymore. Something else was going on here, and Michael had a very bad feeling about where it was heading. "This is ridiculous," Aisha said, stepping forward, her voice rising in anger. "A warrant check? We're college students, not criminals. What is really going on here?" "Yeah, officer," chimed in Carlos, another friend, moving closer. "You came for a noise complaint. We said we'd be quiet. Why are you suddenly acting like we're drug dealers or something?" The younger officer's face flushed slightly, his eyes darting between Michael's friends. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said, his voice becoming louder to be heard over the rising voices. "I'm conducting a lawful procedure. Interference will be considered obstruction." He actually took a small step into the apartment doorway now, increasing the sense of invasion and threat. "Obstruction?" Maria scoffed, crossing her arms. "We're obstructing by asking why you're demanding IDs for a noise complaint? That's insane." Michael held up a hand again, trying to mediate even as his own anger was simmering. Guys, let me handle this." He turned back to the officers. "Officer," he said, directing his words to the woman this time, hoping for a more reasonable response. "Can you please explain what the actual justification is for this warrants check? We're getting really uncomfortable here. We feel like we're being unfairly targeted." The woman officer finally spoke again, but her explanation wasn't much better than her partner's. "As my colleague stated, it's standard procedure when responding to a call. We need to ensure the safety of everyone involved." Her tone was still neutral, but it didn't really address the core issue of why a noise complaint justified escalating to a warrants check and ID demand. Safety? Whose safety is being threatened by a group of college students eating pizza and playing video games? David challenged, his voice tight with disbelief. "Are you serious right now?" The younger officer took another step forward, now practically inside the apartment, and pointed a finger at David. "You, step back now, or you will be obstructing, and you will be facing charges." "Charges?" David exclaimed, taking a step back but not backing down in his stance. "For what? For questioning an unreasonable cop?" "Officer, please," Michael pleaded, trying to keep his voice calm while everything around him was escalating. "Look, I understand. You have a job to do. But we're law-abiding citizens. We haven't done anything wrong. We'll keep the noise down. Can't we just leave it at that? We don't want any trouble." He was trying to appeal to their sense of reason, to de-escalate through cooperation, even though every fiber of him was screaming that this whole situation was wrong. But the younger officer was clearly not interested in de-escalation. He seemed to be taking their questions, their resistance, as a personal affront. He was rigid, unyielding, and seemed determined to exert his authority, no matter how flimsy the initial reason. "No," the younger officer said, his voice hard. "You're going to provide identification. You're going to cooperate, or things are going to get much harder for all of you. Now, driver's license, Mr. Carter. Now." He punctuated the last word with a sharp rap of his hand against the door frame, making everyone jump slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, a live wire humming in the air. Michael was trapped between wanting to assert his rights, knowing he hadn't done anything wrong, and the very real fear that resisting further would only make the situation explode. His friends were angry, scared, feeling cornered. And this whole thing had started because of a noise complaint on a Friday night. It was unbelievable. It was also terrifyingly real. Just as Michael was about to reluctantly pull out his driver's license, feeling a grim resignation settling in, a voice cut through the charged air from behind the two officers in the hallway. "Officer Miller? Officer Davis? What's the holdup here?" Everyone turned to see a third police officer approaching. This one was black, older, with a calm, steady demeanor that seemed to radiate even from a distance. He wore sergeant stripes on his uniform and carried himself with an air of quiet authority. Officer Miller, the younger, more aggressive officer, turned around, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his tone just slightly less confrontational than it had been with Michael and his friends. "Just dealing with a noise complaint, sir. Apartment 3B. Sergeant Johnson stepped closer, his eyes scanning the scene, taking in Michael, his visibly tense friends behind him, Officer Miller and Officer Davis in the doorway, the slightly ajar apartment door. He seemed to assess the situation in a glance. "Noise complaint, huh?" Sergeant Johnson said, his voice calm and level yet carrying a clear weight of command. He turned to Officer Davis, the woman officer. "Officer Davis, what's the situation as you understand it?" Officer Davis gave a brief professional summary, her tone noticeably different now that Sergeant Johnson was present. "We responded to a noise complaint, Sergeant. Upon arrival, we requested identification from the resident as per procedure, but there's been some resistance." She subtly downplayed Officer Miller's more aggressive approach and the warrants check demand. Sergeant Johnson listened without interrupting, his gaze then shifting to Michael. He stepped forward slightly past the other two officers, creating a new dynamic at the doorway. He addressed Michael directly, his voice still calm and respectful. "Mr. Carter, is it?" Sergeant Johnson asked, glancing briefly at the student. "ID Officer Miller still held." "Yes, Sergeant Michael Carter," Michael replied, finding a small measure of relief in Sergeant Johnson's calmer presence and more professional demeanor. "Mr. Carter," Sergeant Johnson continued, "my officers responded to a noise complaint. I understand there's been some friction in the interaction. Can you tell me your side of the situation?" He was asking him directly to explain. It was a complete shift from Officer Miller's confrontational stance. Michael took a breath, trying to organize his thoughts and stay calm despite the lingering adrenaline. "Yes, Sergeant. We were just having a few friends over. It's Friday night. We understand there was a noise complaint. We said we'd turn the music down, keep it quiet. But then Officer Miller started asking for IDs, talking about warrants checks, and it just escalated from there. We're not resisting cooperating, Sergeant. We don't understand why it suddenly became about all of this." He gestured around, encompassing the tense atmosphere, the sense of being treated like criminals. Sergeant Johnson listened intently, his eyes remaining on Michael's face. He nodded slowly as Michael spoke. When Michael finished, Sergeant Johnson turned to Officer Miller, his calm demeanor not wavering, but his voice now firm and clearly directed. "Officer Miller," Sergeant Johnson said, Are you aware of any specific reason to suspect Mr. Carter or his guests of any wrongdoing beyond a noise complaint? Any probable cause for a warrants check at this point?" Officer Miller hesitated for a moment, seeming slightly taken aback by the question. He looked quickly at Sergeant Johnson, then back at Michael and his friends, who were now watching, with a glimmer of renewed hope. Officer Miller's previous confidence seemed to have deflated a little under Sergeant Johnson's steady gaze. "Well, no, Sergeant," Officer Miller admitted, his voice a bit less assertive. "Just standard procedure, responding to a call." He trailed off, the standard procedure justification now sounding weak, even to his own ears. Sergeant Johnson turned back to Michael, a slight shift in his expression, something that almost seemed like an apologetic nod. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice regaining its earlier calm tone, but now carrying a new note of understanding. "I apologize for the misunderstanding here. It seems my officers may have overreacted to the initial call. A noise complaint certainly doesn't automatically warrant a warrants check, especially not in a student housing area on a Friday night." A collective breath seemed to be released in the apartment. The tension, though still present, had noticeably eased. Sergeant Johnson's arrival had indeed been a turning point. But the night was far from over. A flicker of something, was it respect, crossed Sergeant Johnson's face as he looked at Michael. "You're a student here at the university, Mr. Carter?" he asked more conversationally now. "Yes, Sergeant," Michael replied, feeling a bit more grounded. "Pre-law, actually. Political science major, hoping to go to law school next year." He figured mentioning his legal aspirations might subtly shift the dynamic further, highlighting he wasn't just some random student, but someone who understood the system and knew his rights. Sergeant Johnson nodded slowly. "Pre-law," he repeated, a hint of a smile playing around his lips. "Well, then you probably know more about procedure than Officer Miller here sometimes does," he added, with a sideways glance at the younger officer, who remained standing stiffly, clearly not pleased with how things were unfolding. Officer Miller actually huffed quietly, but didn't say anything directly to Sergeant Johnson. Sergeant Johnson turned back to Michael, his tone becoming more serious, again but still calm. "Look, Mr. Carter, bottom line is, we got a complaint." My officers responded. "Things seem to have gotten a bit out of hand. For that, I apologize on behalf of the department. It sounds like you and your friends were just enjoying a Friday night, and it shouldn't have gone down like this." Michael felt a surge of cautious optimism. This was a completely different interaction now. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said, genuinely appreciative. "We appreciate that. We understand noise complaints happen. We just felt like we were being treated unfairly, and things escalated way too quickly." "I get that impression," Sergeant Johnson said, with a direct look at Officer Miller, then back to Michael. "Tell you what, how about we all just take a step back? My officers will clear out. You and your friends keep the noise level reasonable for the rest of the night. And we'll consider this a learning experience for everyone involved, shall we?" He offered a slight, conciliatory smile. Michael nodded, a genuine smile finally breaking out on his face. "That sounds very reasonable, Sergeant. Thank you." He glanced at his friends, who were also visibly relaxing, the tension in their shoulders easing. David spoke up, still a little wary but much calmer than before. "So, no IDs? No warrants check? Just, we keep it down and you guys leave?" Sergeant Johnson chuckled lightly. "Exactly, unless," he added, his eyes twinkling slightly, "you want me to stick around and critique your pizza choices? I'm a bit of a pizza connoisseur myself." A few nervous chuckles rippled through Michael's friends. The sergeant's attempt at humor was actually working, further diffusing the charged atmosphere. "Pizza's pretty standard college fare, Sergeant," Michael said, smiling back. "Cheese and pepperoni. But critiques are welcome any time, under less Stressful circumstances. Deal, Sergeant Johnson said. He turned to his officers. Officers, Miller, Davis, let's go. Let Mr. Carter and his friends get back to their evening. He gestured for them to precede him out of the hallway. Officer Davis nodded crisply and turned to leave. Officer Miller, however, still seemed reluctant. He gave Michael and his friends one last, lingering, somewhat resentful look, before finally following Sergeant Johnson and Officer Davis out of the building. As soon as the officers were gone, and the sound of their footsteps faded down the hallway, a collective sigh of relief swept through Michael's apartment. "Wow," Aisha breathed out, shaking her head. "That was intense." "Intense is an understatement," Maria agreed, still looking a little pale. "I thought for a second they were actually going to— I don't even know what they were going to do." David clapped Michael on the shoulder. "Dude, you were amazing. Staying so calm, knowing your rights. Pre-law hero right there." Michael shrugged, still feeling a bit shaky himself, but also a sense of quiet satisfaction. His legal knowledge, even in its early stages, had actually made a difference. It had helped him navigate a potentially explosive situation, and maybe, just maybe, helped prevent something much worse from happening. But as the relief settled, a new set of questions began to surface in Michael's mind. Why had Officer Miller reacted that way? Why the sudden escalation to warrants checks for a simple noise complaint? And who was the neighbor who had called in the complaint in the first place? This night was far from truly over. The friends spent the next hour or so slowly unwinding, the remnants of the earlier tension still hanging in the air, but gradually dissipating with more pizza and less intense conversation. Aisha returned with the root beer, but the Friday night vibe felt different. The easy lightness had been replaced by a more subdued atmosphere, a sense of unease lingering beneath the surface. "So, who do we think called?" Carlos asked, breaking a silence as they were finishing off the last pizza slice. "Anyone know which neighbor in 3B it is?" Michael frowned, thinking. "Apartment 3B, that's old Mrs. Henderson, right? The lady who's always complaining about something?" He recalled seeing a small elderly woman with a perpetually sour expression occasionally in the hallway. "Yeah, Mrs. Henderson," Maria confirmed. "Always. Seems to have a problem with someone or something. Remember last month, she called building management about someone slamming their door too loudly at 2 p.m. in the afternoon? Or the time she complained about the smell of foreign cooking from apartment 2A, David added, rolling his eyes. Seriously, foreign cooking? What even is that supposed to mean? Aisha snorted. Sounds like Mrs. Henderson just likes to complain. Maybe she was just having a bad night and our music, even if it wasn't that loud, just set her off. Maybe, Michael said slowly, but something didn't quite sit right with him. Mrs. Henderson being a general complainer, yes, that fit. But a noise complaint leading to police at the door, and then Officer Miller's aggressive reaction. Warrants check demands. It still felt like overkill, even for Mrs. Henderson. I'm just saying, Michael continued, it still feels like Officer Miller was looking for something. Warrants check for a noise complaint? That's not normal, guys. Even Officer Davis seemed uncomfortable with it. It was all Officer Miller pushing it. David nodded thoughtfully. Yeah, you're right. Maybe Mrs. Henderson's call was just the excuse he needed to, I don't know, check us out? Check us out for what? Maria asked, her brow furrowed. Because we're a group of black and brown students hanging out on a Friday night? The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Was race a factor here? They hadn't explicitly said it, but it was the elephant in the room, the uncomfortable possibility that no one wanted to voice directly, but everyone was thinking. Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe it was just a grumpy neighbor and an overzealous cop having a bad night. He wanted to believe that simple explanation. It was easier, less disturbing. But then Aisha said quietly, Remember last week when Mrs. Henderson was in the elevator with me? She was muttering about those college kids and all the noise they make, disturbing decent people, and she looked right at me when she said decent people. Aisha paused, her expression troubled. It felt pointed, you know? A cold feeling settled in Michael's stomach. Pointed how? He asked, his voice low. Aisha shrugged, uncomfortably. Just like she meant us. Like decent people was code for something. Something not us. Silence descended on the room again, heavier this time. The implications of Aisha's words hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Could it be that simple, and yet that ugly? That a neighbor's complaint wasn't just about noise, but about who was making the noise, and that an officer's overreaction wasn't just overzealousness, but something else? Michael looked around at his friends, their faces now reflecting a mix of worry and a dawning, uncomfortable realization. The Friday night vibe was long gone, replaced by something far more sobering. They had been let off with a warning tonight, thanks to Sergeant Johnson. But the feeling that something deeper, something unsettling lay beneath the surface of this noise complaint was growing stronger, and Michael knew, deep down, that this wasn't over yet. Driven by a need to understand what had really happened, Michael decided he couldn't just let it go. "I'm going to talk to Mrs. Henderson," he announced suddenly, pushing back his chair. His friends looked at him, surprised. "Tonight?" Maria asked. "Are you sure that's a good idea? It's late, and she doesn't exactly seem receptive to conversation." "Maybe not," Michael admitted. "But I need to know. Was it really just noise, or was it something else? If we just ignore it, it's going to keep eating at me. And maybe," he added, thinking aloud, "maybe if we understand where she's coming from, it could actually de-escalate things in the future?" It was a long shot, he knew, but he had to try something more proactive than just stewing in uneasy suspicion. "I'll go with you," David offered immediately, grabbing his jacket. "Moral support and backup if Mrs. Henderson turns out to be less than friendly." "Thanks, man," Michael said, appreciating the gesture. He hesitated. "Anyone else want to come?" Maria and Aisha exchanged glances, then nodded. "Yeah, we're in," Maria said, standing up. "Strength. In numbers, right?" Aisha grinned slightly. "Plus, maybe Mrs. Henderson will be less likely to accuse us of disturbing decent people if there are women present too." So a small delegation of Michael and his three friends made their way to the third floor down the hallway, to apartment 3B. The hallway felt quieter than before, the Friday night buzz replaced by a kind of hushed expectancy. Michael knocked gently on Mrs. Henderson's door. They waited. Silence. He knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. He was starting to think she wasn't home, or was simply ignoring them, when they finally heard a slow shuffling sound from inside, and the door creaked open a crack. Mrs. Henderson peered out at them. Her eyes narrowed, her face immediately sour as she took in the sight of four young people standing at her doorstep. "Yes?" she said curtly, her voice raspy and unwelcoming. "What is it? I already called the police. What more do you want?" Michael stepped forward slightly, trying to project a calm, non-threatening demeanor. "Mrs. Henderson, hi, my name is Michael Carter. I live in 4A. We just wanted to talk for a minute, if you have time, about the noise complaint earlier." Mrs. Henderson's expression didn't soften. "Noise complaint? It wasn't just noise, young man. It was a racket, disturbing the peace. Some people around here actually value peace and quiet, you know." "Yes, ma'am, we understand that," Michael said, keeping his voice even. "And we really are sorry if we were too loud. We honestly didn't realize. We'll definitely keep it down in the future." He paused, then took a deeper breath, deciding to be a bit more direct, but still carefully polite. "But Mrs. Henderson, we were just wondering, was it really just the noise that bothered you? Or was there something else? Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed further. Something else? What's that supposed to mean? She snapped defensively. Aisha stepped forward a little, her voice soft but clear. Mrs. Henderson, when you were in the elevator last week, I overheard you talking about those college kids and decent people. It just made me wonder if maybe it's not just about the noise. Mrs. Henderson's face flushed slightly, but she still held her ground, her tone hardening. I don't know what you're implying, young lady. I just want peace and quiet in my building. Is that too much to ask? No, ma'am, of course not, Michael interjected quickly, trying to keep things from escalating again. It's just, it felt like tonight, with the police coming and how quickly it got tense. It felt like more than just a simple noise complaint. It felt disproportionate. At that moment, just as the conversation seemed to be hitting another wall, they heard footsteps approaching again from down the hallway. And then Sergeant Johnson reappeared, walking towards them, a slightly surprised but still composed expression on his face. Mr. Carter, everything all right here? Sergeant Johnson asked, glancing from Michael and his friends to Mrs. Henderson at her slightly open door. Mrs. Henderson stiffened even further, her eyes widening a fraction as she saw Sergeant Johnson. Officer, yes, officer. These young people are harassing me now, coming to my door, bothering me late at night. She was playing the victim, Michael realized, and doing it expertly. Sergeant Johnson held up a hand calmly, addressing Mrs. Henderson directly. Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm Sergeant Johnson. I was just speaking with Mr. Carter and his friends earlier. They were clarifying a misunderstanding. Were they being disrespectful to you in any way? He kept his tone neutral, but there was a clear undercurrent of authority. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, thrown off by Sergeant Johnson's directness. Well, no, not exactly. But they're here, late at night, questioning my complaint. Her voice trailed off, her accusatory tone losing some of its force. Sergeant Johnson turned back to Michael, his expression still calm but now with a hint of something else. Understanding, quiet disapproval of Mrs. Henderson's tactics. Michael couldn't quite read it, but it felt supportive. Mr. Carter, Sergeant Johnson said, in a clear, audible voice that Mrs. Henderson couldn't help but overhear, perhaps you and your friends would be willing to step back into your apartment. I'd like to have a brief word with Mrs. Henderson privately, if you don't mind. Michael understood immediately. Sergeant Johnson was taking over, handling it, protecting them, in a way, from further potential accusations or escalation by Mrs. Henderson. Of course, Sergeant, Michael said gratefully. Thank you. He nodded to his friends, and they all quietly retreated back to Michael's apartment, leaving Sergeant Johnson standing in the hallway, facing Mrs. Henderson's still ajar door. They didn't hear what Sergeant Johnson said to Mrs. Henderson, but they saw Mrs. Henderson's door close fully a few minutes later, and then Sergeant Johnson walked back down the hallway and rapped lightly on Michael's open door frame. Michael stepped forward again, expectantly. Sergeant Johnson's expression was thoughtful. Mr. Carter, Sergeant Johnson said, his voice low, I had a frank conversation with Mrs. Henderson. It seems there may have been some underlying biases contributing to her complaint. Tonight, beyond just the noise level. He paused, then continued. And regarding Officer Miller's actions, well, let's just say I will be addressing that internally with him. His conduct wasn't entirely in line with department protocol or community expectations. He chose his words carefully, but the message was clear. Then, Sergeant Johnson did something Michael hadn't anticipated. He extended his hand to Michael. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice now carrying a clear note of sincerity. On behalf of the police department, and especially regarding the actions of Officer Miller, I want to offer you a formal apology. You and your friends were within your rights to enjoy a quiet Friday evening. You deserve to be treated with respect, and that didn't fully happen tonight. I hope you can accept my apology and that we can consider this closed." Michael was stunned. A real apology? From a police sergeant? It was more than he could have expected. He shook Sergeant Johnson's hand firmly. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his voice sincere, "thank you. Thank you for understanding and for setting things right." He meant it. It wasn't just about the apology. It was about being seen, being heard, being acknowledged. It was about justice, in a small but very real way, being served. Tonight, at least. The rest of the weekend was quieter than Michael and his friends had planned, but in a thoughtful way, not tense. The pizza was finished, the root beer drunk, but the conversation lingered on what had happened Friday night. Sergeant Johnson was surprisingly cool, right? David commented on Sunday afternoon as they were studying together. In the campus library, books open, but mostly untouched. "I didn't expect a cop to actually apologize like that, especially not to us." "Yeah," Maria agreed, nodding slowly. "It was different. Officer Miller was like something out of a bad movie, all aggressive and comply now, ask, questions never. And then Sergeant Johnson just turned it around." Aisha was looking out the window, thoughtful. "It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? About how often it doesn't turn around. How often it's just Officer Miller, no Sergeant Johnson coming along. How often does it escalate way beyond a noise complaint, with no apology, no accountability?" The library fell silent for a moment, the weight of Aisha's words hanging in the air. Michael knew she was right. They had gotten relatively lucky. Sergeant Johnson had shown up. Michael had some basic legal knowledge to articulate his rights, even though he had been hesitant to push it too far with Officer Miller. But what if those factors hadn't been present? What if it had just been Officer Miller and Officer Davis, and Michael hadn't known to even question the warrants check? "Demand? It's messed up," Carlos said, finally breaking the silence. "It's messed up that just hanging out with friends can turn into a thing like that. Just because of who we are, or how we look, or where we live." Michael nodded, his thoughts swirling. He looked down at his open law textbook, the chapter heading Civil Rights and Liberties, starkly printed at the top of the page. It felt different now, less abstract, less academic. Friday night had slammed the theoretical concepts of rights and liberties right into the messy reality of his own life. "We should do something," Maria said suddenly, sitting up straighter. "Not just talk about how messed up it is. Actually do something." "Like what?" David asked, raising an eyebrow. "Start a Students Against Noise Complaint Injustices Club?" he joked, but there was a serious undercurrent to his tone. "No, not that exactly," Maria said with a thoughtful frown. "But maybe we could work with the Pre-Law Society? Organize a workshop on Know Your Rights when interacting with police? For students? For the community? Michael, you're in the society, right?" Michael looked up, a new spark of energy igniting in him. "Yeah, I am," he said slowly, considering the idea. "That's actually a really good idea, Maria. We could get some real lawyers, maybe even someone from the ACLU, to come in and talk. We could make it practical, focus on real-life scenarios like noise complaints that turn into warrant checks," he added with a wry smile. "Exactly," Maria said, getting more enthusiastic. "We could call it Friday Night Rights or something catchy like that. Make it a regular thing. Help other students, especially students of color, know what to do if they get stopped, if things escalate. Just like what happened to us." The energy in the library shifted again, from reflective unease to something more proactive, more hopeful. The frustration of Friday night was starting to channel itself into a positive direction. Michael felt a sense of purpose growing within him. He had chosen to study law because he wanted to make a difference, to understand the system, and to help people. He had been learning about legal theory in textbooks and classrooms. But Friday night had been a real-world, raw, up-close and personal lesson in what the law actually meant, and what it meant to need it, and what it meant to have even a little bit of knowledge about it. And he realized, with a growing conviction, that his law school journey wasn't just about grades and casebooks anymore. It was about real people, real situations, real rights. And maybe, just maybe, he and his friends, starting with a noise complaint on a Friday night, could actually help make things a little better, a little fairer, for others in their community. It was a start. Friday Night Rights took off faster than Michael and his friends could have imagined. They pitched the idea to the pre-law society, and it was met with instant enthusiasm. The society faculty advisor, a sharp, experienced law professor, offered her full support and helped them get campus resources, find speakers, and publicize the event. Within weeks, they had flyers up all over campus and around town. Simple posters with bold lettering. Friday Night Rights. Know your rights in police encounters. They booked a campus auditorium for the first workshop, expecting maybe 50 people to show up. To their surprise, over 200 people crammed into the auditorium that first Friday night. Students of all backgrounds, community members, even a few local activists and journalists. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of concern, curiosity, and a shared desire for knowledge and empowerment. Michael, Maria, David, and Aisha all spoke at the workshop, sharing their Friday night experience. Honestly, vulnerably, and powerfully. They didn't demonize the police, but they didn't sugarcoat what had happened either. They focused on the escalation, the fear, the feeling of being targeted, and how Sergeant Johnson's intervention had made all the difference. Then a local civil rights lawyer, invited by their professor, took the stage and gave a clear, concise presentation on legal rights during police stops. What to do, what not to do, how to stay safe, how to assert your rights without escalating tensions. Sergeant Johnson, having been invited and cleared by his superiors to attend in a community liaison capacity, even spoke briefly, reiterating the police department's commitment to community relations and respectful interactions, without directly addressing the specifics of Friday's incident, but subtly acknowledging the need for improved understanding. The workshop was a huge success. Students asked pointed questions, shared their own experiences, and left with handouts outlining key legal points and resources. Friday Night Rights became a regular monthly event, growing in popularity and impact each time. They expanded the topics, from traffic stops to stop and frisk, to dealing with noise complaints, to understanding local ordinances. Michael and his friends found themselves not just studying the law, but actively using their knowledge to educate and empower others. They were turning a negative experience into a positive force for change. And in doing so, Michael felt his own understanding of justice and his own commitment to pursuing a legal career focused on civil rights deepen and solidify. Months later, Michael ran into Sergeant Johnson again, not at his apartment door this time, but at a community fair on campus. Sergeant Johnson approached him with a smile and a friendly nod. "Mr. Carter," Sergeant Johnson said, extending his hand. "Heard good things about your Friday Night Rights workshops. Making a real difference, I hear." Michael smiled back, shaking his hand warmly. "Thanks, Sergeant. We're trying. And thank you again for what you did that night. It really did make a difference. Not just for us, but it set things in motion." Sergeant Johnson nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all have a role to play in making things better, Mr. Carter. Police department, community, future lawyers, like yourself. It's about understanding, communication, and accountability. Mistakes happen. What matters is how we learn from them and how we move forward." He paused, then added, a slight smile returning to his lips. And maybe, he chuckled, next time you have a Friday night gathering, just keep the bass a little lower, huh? Just for community relations' sake, Michael laughed, genuinely this time. Deal, Sergeant, bass will be respectfully restrained. As they stood there, two young men, one a future lawyer, one a veteran police sergeant, a sense of quiet hope settled in the air. Friday night hadn't been just a noise complaint. It had been a moment of tension, misunderstanding, and potential injustice. But it had also become a catalyst for dialogue, for understanding, for action, and for a small but significant step forward. The path to real justice was long and complex and full of challenges. But every step in the right direction mattered. Every conversation, every apology, every workshop, every effort to bridge divides and build understanding. It all counted. And sometimes even a Friday night noise complaint could be the unexpected starting point for something positive, something meaningful, something that could actually make a difference. So, what do you think of Michael's story? It started with something as simple as a noise complaint, but it showed us how easily misunderstandings can happen, and how important it is to know your rights. It also reminds us that even when things get tough, turning those experiences into action and education can create real change in our communities. Have you ever had an experience where a simple situation suddenly escalated? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're always interested to hear your perspectives. If you enjoyed Michael's journey and believe in the power of community action, please give this video a like. Share it with your friends so we can spread the word about knowing your rights. And of course, if you haven't already, subscribe to FM Tales and hit that notification bell. We're working towards 1,000 subscribers to keep bringing you more stories that inspire and make you think. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.